Detective Sarah Mitchell sat across from the small figure in the interview room, feeling the weight of failure pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. 3 months. It had been 3 months since 8-year-old Emma Torres had spoken a single word to anyone, not to her grandmother, not to the therapists, not to the police, and certainly not about the night that had shattered her world into a million silent pieces. The room was designed to be comforting, with soft lighting, pastel walls decorated with cheerful butterflies, and shelves filled with toys and stuffed animals. None of it made any difference. Emma sat in an oversized chair that made her look even smaller than she was, her knees pulled tightly to her chest, arms wrapped around her legs in a protective cocoon. Her dark eyes, once bright and full of life, according to her grandmother, now stared at the wall with a haunting emptiness that made Sarah's heart ache. Sarah had been a detective with the Portland Police Department for 15 years. She'd worked hundreds of cases, interviewed countless victims, and prided herself on her ability to connect with traumatized witnesses, especially children. But Emma Torres had become her greatest challenge and her most devastating failure. The case file on Sarah's desk told a horrifying story. On the night of October 15th, someone had broken into the Torres family's modest home in southeast Portland. Emma's mother, Maria Torres, a single parent working 2 jobs to make ends meet, had been in the kitchen when she heard the crash of breaking glass. The intruder, masked and dressed entirely in black, had demanded money. When Maria tried to fight back, he'd beaten her savagely with a metal pipe, leaving her with a fractured skull, broken ribs, and injuries that required 3 surgeries. Emma had witnessed everything from her hiding spot behind the living room couch. She'd watched the attack unfold, heard her mother's screams, seen the blood pooling on their kitchen floor. And then she'd watched something else, something crucial that only she could testify to. In the struggle, Maria had torn off the intruder's mask. For just a few seconds, Emma had seen his face clearly in the glow of the kitchen light. That face belonged to Marcus Webb, according to the forensic evidence. Webb was a known criminal with a record of violent burglaries. His fingerprints were found on the windowsill. Fibers from his jacket matched material caught on the broken glass. His boots matched impressions found in the backyard. The circumstantial evidence was strong, but Webb's defense attorney, Robert Kaufman, a skilled lawyer known for getting violent criminals acquitted on technicalities, was already poking holes in the prosecution's case. The fingerprints could have been from an earlier visit, Kaufman argued. Webb had done odd jobs in the neighborhood. Maybe he'd touched that window weeks before. The boot prints, hundreds of people owned that brand. The jacket fibers, purely circumstantial. Without Emma's eyewitness testimony, without her ability to point at Marcus Webb and say definitively, "That's the man who hurt my mother," the case was falling apart like wet tissue paper. And Emma couldn't speak. Sarah had tried everything she could think of. She'd brought in Dr. Jennifer Hammond, a renowned child psychologist who specialized in trauma cases. Dr. Hammond had spent weeks with Emma, using play therapy, art therapy, and gentle questioning techniques. Emma would draw pictures, dark, disturbing images of shadows and red streaks that clearly represented blood, but she wouldn't talk about them. She'd play with dolls, sometimes acting out violent scenes that made the observers want to cry, but her lips remained sealed. The medical doctors had examined Emma thoroughly. There was nothing physically wrong with her vocal cords or her ability to speak. This was selective mutism, brought on by severe psychological trauma. Her brain had essentially shut down her ability to communicate verbally as a protective mechanism. She'd witnessed something so terrifying that her mind had decided silence was the only safe option. Maria Torres, still recovering from her injuries and now confined to a wheelchair for physical therapy sessions, was desperate. Sarah had visited her at her sister's house just yesterday, where Maria and Emma were temporarily living. Maria's eyes, so similar to her daughter's, had filled with tears as she clutched Sarah's hand. "Please," Maria had whispered, her voice still weak from the injuries to her throat. That monster did this to me, and now he's stealing my daughter's voice too. Emma used to sing all the time. She was always talking, laughing, telling me about her day at school. Now she's like a ghost. I see her slipping further away every day, and I can't reach her. I can't protect her from what's in her own mind. The weight of that responsibility was crushing Sarah. She'd made a promise to Maria, a promise she was terrified she couldn't keep, that she would find a way to help Emma and put Marcus Webb behind bars where he belonged. Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Park was losing patience. Just this morning she'd called Sarah into her office, the frustration evident in every line of her face. "The trial is in 2 weeks, Sarah. 2 weeks. Judge Whitfield won't grant another continuance. If Emma can't testify, I'm going to have to rely on circumstantial evidence alone, and Kaufman will tear it apart. Webb will walk, and he'll probably sue the city for wrongful prosecution while he's at it." Sarah had left that meeting feeling defeated. She'd walked the halls of the police department aimlessly, trying to think of something, anything, she hadn't tried yet. That's when she'd run into Officer David Chen in the break room. Chen was pouring coffee when Sarah slumped into a chair with a heavy sigh. "That bad?" he'd asked, his voice sympathetic. "Worse," Sarah had replied, and then because Chen was a good listener and she needed to vent, she told him everything about Emma Torres, the attack, the silence, the crumbling case, the ticking clock. Chen had listened quietly, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. Then he'd said something that had seemed absurd at first. "What if we bring in Ranger?" "Ranger?" Sarah had looked up confused. "My facility dog, the one I work with in victim services." Sarah had heard about the department's new facility dog program, a pilot project that Chen had championed for 2 years before getting approval and funding. But she'd never actually seen Ranger work. "A dog?" The skepticism in her voice had been obvious. "David, we've tried everything. Child psychologists, therapists, art therapy, play therapy. What's a dog going to do that trained professionals couldn't?" Chen had smiled gently. "Sarah, I've seen Ranger work miracles. He's not just a pet. He's been specifically bred and trained to help trauma victims, especially children. There's something about dogs. They don't judge, they don't pressure, they just exist with you. They offer comfort without demands. I've worked with kids who have been through terrible things, and Ranger has this ability to reach them in ways we humans can't." Sarah had wanted to dismiss it immediately. A dog couldn't solve this problem. But desperation makes people consider options they'd normally reject without a second thought. And the look in Chen's eyes, the genuine belief that this might actually help, made her pause. "It can't hurt to try," Chen had continued. "What do we have to lose?" What indeed? The case was already lost without Emma's testimony. Marcus Webb was going to walk free regardless. Maybe, just maybe, this crazy idea with a therapy dog might be the breakthrough they needed. Now sitting in this interview room with silent Emma for what felt like the 100th time, Sarah made a decision. She pulled out her phone and texted Chen, "Let's try it. Bring Ranger tomorrow. Same time, same place." She looked at Emma, who still hadn't acknowledged Sarah's presence despite being in the room together for 40 minutes. "Emma," Sarah said softly, "I want you to meet someone tomorrow, someone special who I think might help you feel safer. His name is Ranger, and he's a very good friend of mine." Emma's eyes didn't move from the wall, but Sarah thought. Maybe she was imagining it, but she thought. She saw the smallest flicker of interest cross the little girl's face. As Sarah left the advocacy center that evening, the Portland sky was darkening with rain clouds, matching her mood. She had no idea if this plan with the therapy dog would work. She had no idea if Emma would ever speak again, if Maria would ever see justice for what had been done to her, if Marcus Webb would finally pay for his crimes. But tomorrow they would try something different. Tomorrow, a golden retriever named Ranger would walk into that interview room, and maybe, just maybe, he would succeed where everyone else had failed. Sarah didn't know it yet, but tomorrow would be the beginning of something extraordinary. Tomorrow would be the first step in a journey that would end in a courtroom, with two words that would change everything, and a dog's instinctive action that would shock an entire community. But tonight, all Sarah could do was hope. Hope that somewhere in Emma's silence, there was still a voice waiting to be found. Hope that sometimes the answer to human problems comes with four paws and a gentle heart. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. Officer David Chen woke up at 5:30 a.m., the way he did every morning, to the familiar sound of a wet nose nudging his hand. Ranger, all 70 pounds of golden retriever enthusiasm, stood beside the bed with his tail wagging, ready to start another day of doing what he loved most, helping people. "All right, buddy," David said with a smile, scratching behind Ranger's soft ears. "Big day today. We've got someone very special to meet." As David went through their morning routine, feeding Ranger his precisely measured breakfast, checking his grooming, making sure his blue service vest was clean and properly fitted, he thought about the call he'd received from Detective Mitchell. He'd heard the desperation in her voice, the weight of a case that was slipping through her fingers. He'd encountered that tone before, from officers who'd exhausted every traditional option and were willing to try something that seemed, on the surface, completely unconventional. Ranger wasn't just any dog, though most people didn't understand that until they saw him work. David had spent 3 years researching facility dog programs before convincing the Portland Police Department to invest in one. He'd traveled to Seattle, to Denver, to New York, observing how these specially trained animals were transforming victim services and courthouse testimony across the country. The statistics were compelling. Children who testified with facility dogs showed significantly less stress, gave more detailed and accurate testimony, and experienced fewer long-term trauma symptoms. But statistics didn't capture what David had witnessed firsthand: the moment when a child who hadn't spoken in months would whisper their first words into a dog's fur, or when a sexual assault survivor found the courage to face their attacker with a gentle weight pressed against their leg. Ranger had come from Canine Companions for Independence, an organization that bred and trained assistance dogs for various purposes. But Ranger's training had been specialized. For 2 years, he'd learned to remain perfectly calm in chaotic environments, to sense human emotional distress through subtle cues like elevated heart rate and stress hormones in sweat, and to provide comfort without being intrusive or demanding attention. Unlike therapy dogs who visited hospitals or nursing homes, facility dogs were trained to work in high-stress environments: police interviews, courtrooms, forensic examinations. They learned to lie motionless for hours if needed, to remain calm around shouting or crying, to never react aggressively no matter what was happening around them. David had been paired with Ranger 18 months ago, and the bond between them was extraordinary. David could read Ranger's subtle body language, the slight tilt of his head that indicated he'd sensed someone's anxiety spiking, the gentle lean into a person's leg that offered support, the way his breathing would slow and deepen when he was working to calm someone down. They'd worked with 43 victims since becoming a certified team: domestic violence survivors who couldn't face their abusers, elderly fraud victims struggling with memory recall, child witnesses who'd seen things no child should ever see. Ranger's success rate was remarkable. Over 80% of witnesses who worked with him were able to provide clearer, more complete statements than in their initial interviews. But David had never brought Ranger into an actual trial. That was uncharted territory for their department, and he knew it would face legal challenges. Still, if it meant helping a traumatized child find her voice and putting a violent criminal behind bars, he was willing to face whatever obstacles came their way. As David loaded Ranger into his SUV, he reviewed what Detective Mitchell had told him about Emma Torres: selective mutism from witnessing extreme violence, 3 months of silence, multiple failed intervention attempts, the ticking clock of a trial date that couldn't be postponed again. "This one's going to be tough, buddy," David said, glancing at Ranger in the rearview mirror. The dog's tongue lolled out in what looked like a smile, his tail thumping against the seat. Ranger loved his job. He seemed to understand, in whatever way dogs comprehend such things, that he was making a difference. They arrived at the Child Advocacy Center at 9:45 a.m., 15 minutes before the scheduled meeting. David wanted time to let Ranger relieve himself, check the environment, and prepare for what could be a long, challenging session. Detective Mitchell met them in the parking lot looking exhausted. David suspected she hadn't slept much. "Thank you for doing this," she said, kneeling down to greet Ranger properly. The dog sniffed her hand, then gave it a gentle lick, his version of "nice to meet you." "No promises," David cautioned. "Every child responds differently. Some warm up immediately, others take time. Emma's been through severe trauma, so we need to be patient and let her set the pace." They walked through the building's cheerful corridors, past walls decorated with children's artwork and inspirational quotes. David had been here dozens of times, but it never got easier knowing what the children in these rooms had experienced. Emma's grandmother, Rosa Torres, was waiting outside the interview room. She looked up hopefully when she saw them approaching, her eyes widening when she noticed Ranger. "Is this?" she began. "This is Ranger," David confirmed. "He's here to help Emma feel safe. Has anyone explained to her that we're bringing a dog today?" Rosa nodded. "Detective Mitchell told her yesterday." Emma's eyes got a little wider. "It was the most reaction I've seen from her in weeks. She loves animals. Before everything happened, she was always begging me for a puppy." That was a good sign. David had learned that children who loved animals often responded well to Ranger's presence. "Okay," he said. "We're going to go very slowly. I'll bring Ranger in, but I won't force any interaction. We'll just exist in the same space and see what happens." Sarah opened the door to the interview room. Emma sat in the same oversized chair where she'd spent countless silent hours, looking exactly as Sarah had described. Small, curled up, eyes fixed on nothing, her whole body radiating pain and fear that had nowhere to go. David's heart clenched. He'd seen many traumatized children, but something about Emma's absolute stillness, the way she seemed to be trying to disappear into herself, was particularly heartbreaking. He entered quietly, Ranger walking calmly at his side on a loose leash. The dog's ears were relaxed, his tail wagging gently, his body language broadcasting friend in every possible way. David didn't speak, didn't try to get Emma's attention. He simply sat down on the floor across the room, giving her plenty of space, and released Ranger's leash. "Free," he said softly, the command that told Ranger he could move independently and do his work. For several minutes, nothing happened. Ranger lay down on the floor, his head resting on his paws, occasionally glancing at Emma but not approaching. David pulled out his phone and pretended to check emails, making himself as unimportant and non-threatening as possible. Through the one-way mirror, he knew Sarah and Rosa were watching, probably wondering if this was just going to be another failed attempt. 10 minutes passed, 15, 20. Emma hadn't moved, hadn't acknowledged their presence at all. David began to wonder if maybe this wouldn't work, if Emma's trauma was so deep that even Ranger couldn't reach her. Then, at minute 23, Ranger's head lifted. His ears perked forward slightly, and David recognized that look. Ranger had sensed something. A change in Emma's breathing, perhaps, or a subtle shift in her body language invisible to human eyes. Slowly, with the careful deliberation that was his trademark, Ranger stood up. He stretched, a move that looked casual but David knew was intentional, making himself less threatening by acting completely relaxed. Then Ranger began walking toward Emma, not in a direct line but in a gentle curve, giving her time to process his approach. Emma's body tensed. Her arms tightened around her knees, and for a moment David thought she might panic. He prepared to call Ranger back. But Ranger seemed to sense her fear. He stopped about 3 feet away, sat down, and simply looked at her. Not with the intensity of a stare, but with the soft, patient gaze that had melted so many hearts. His tail swept slowly back and forth across the floor, sweep, 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 a gentle rhythm that was somehow calming just to watch. They stayed like that for another 5 minutes. Then Ranger lay down again, this time closer to Emma, and rested his head on his paws with a deep, contented sigh that seemed to say, "I'm not going anywhere. I'll wait as long as you need." Something in that sigh seemed to reach Emma in a way words never had. David saw it, the smallest softening in her rigid posture, the slight turn of her head in Ranger's direction. She wasn't looking at the dog directly, but she was aware of him now, acknowledging his presence in her space. Another 10 minutes passed in silence. David had learned long ago that patience was the most important tool in his kit. Rush a traumatized child and you'd lose whatever progress you'd made. But give them time, give them space, let them come to you on their own terms. Ranger moved again, this time crawling forward on his belly in a submissive posture that made him look less like a 70-pound dog and more like a gentle, fuzzy carpet. He inched closer to Emma's chair, moving so slowly it was almost imperceptible. Then he did what he'd done dozens of times before. He rested his head on Emma's knee. The effect was immediate and profound. Emma's whole body jerked slightly, as if she'd been shocked. Her eyes, which had been so carefully avoiding looking at anything real, suddenly focused on the golden head resting against her leg. David held his breath. Emma's hand began to move. It trembled violently, shaking like a leaf in a hurricane, but it moved. Her small fingers extended, hesitated, then touched Ranger's soft fur. A single tear rolled down Emma's cheek, then another. Then suddenly she was crying, silent, shaking sobs that seemed to come from the deepest part of her soul. Her fingers dug into Ranger's fur, clutching him like a lifeline in a storm. Ranger didn't move. He stayed perfectly still, letting this little girl use him as an anchor while emotions she'd bottled up for 3 months finally found a release. His eyes found David's across the room, and David gave the smallest nod of approval. "Good boy," he mouthed silently. "You're doing perfect." They stayed like that for 20 minutes, Emma crying silently, Ranger providing steady, non-judgmental support, David remaining quiet and unobtrusive in the background. Finally, Emma's tears began to slow. Her grip on Ranger's fur relaxed slightly, turning from desperate clutching to gentle stroking. And then, so quietly that David almost missed it, she whispered her first word in 3 months. "Soft." David's eyes met Sarah's through the one-way mirror. He saw the detective's hand fly to her mouth, saw the hope blazing in her eyes. This was the breakthrough they'd been desperately seeking. But this was just the beginning. Getting Emma to say one word to a dog was vastly different from getting her to testify in a courtroom full of people, facing the man who destroyed her sense of safety. Still, as David watched Emma continue to pet Ranger, whispering to him in words too soft to hear, he felt a familiar sense of hope. He'd seen this before, the moment when a dog's unconditional acceptance created a safe space where healing could finally begin. "Good boy, Ranger," David whispered. "Now let's see if we can work a miracle." Outside the room, Rosa Torres was crying tears of joy. For the first time in 3 months, her granddaughter had spoken. It was only one word, but that one word was everything. The real work was about to begin. The afternoon sun filtered through the blinds of the Child Advocacy Center's interview room, casting gentle stripes of light across the floor where Ranger lay, his head still resting on Emma's knee. That single whispered word, soft, hung in the air like a promise of things to come. Officer David Chen remained motionless on the floor, afraid that any sudden movement might shatter this fragile moment of connection. Detective Sarah Mitchell watched through the one-way mirror, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. In 15 years of police work, she'd witnessed many dramatic moments, arrests, confessions, courtroom verdicts. But none had affected her quite like watching this small, traumatized girl speak her first word in 3 months to a golden retriever who seemed to understand her pain better than any human could. Rosa Torres stood beside Sarah, tears streaming down her weathered face as she clutched a tissue in her trembling hands. "She spoke," Rosa whispered, her voice breaking. "My Emma spoke. Thank you, God, thank you." Inside the room, Emma's fingers continued their gentle exploration of Ranger's fur, moving from his head down to his silky ears. The dog remained perfectly still, as if he understood that his patient immobility was the key to keeping this little girl engaged. His brown eyes were half closed in contentment, his breathing slow and steady, a living meditation on peace and safety. "Soft," Emma whispered again, this time with slightly more confidence. Then, after a long pause, she added another word, "warm." David felt tears prickling at his own eyes, but he blinked them away. He needed to stay professional, calm, unobtrusive. He'd learned through experience that the worst thing he could do right now was to make a big deal out of Emma's words, to rush forward with praise or questions. That would remind her that adults were watching, judging, waiting for something from her. And that pressure was exactly what had kept her silent for so long. Instead, David pulled out a small notebook and pretended to write something, as if Emma's breakthrough was the most natural thing in the world. "Ranger really likes when people notice how soft he is," David said conversationally, keeping his voice low and even. "He gets brushed every single day to keep his fur that way." Emma's eyes flickered toward David for just a second, the first time she'd made any eye contact with him, then returned to Ranger. Her hand stilled on the dog's head, and for a moment David thought he'd spoken too soon, pushed too hard. But then Emma's lips moved again. "Every day," she whispered. Progress, a question, engagement with the world beyond her internal prison of fear and silence. "Every single day," David confirmed, still keeping his tone casual. "Sometimes twice a day if he's been working hard. He's a very important dog with a very important job, so he has to look his best." Emma's forehead wrinkled slightly, a hint of curiosity breaking through the blank mask she'd worn for months. "What job?" David's heart soared, but he kept his expression neutral. He helps people who are scared or sad. He sits with them and lets them know they're not alone. Sometimes people have seen really scary things, and Ranger helps them feel safe enough to talk about it. The room fell silent again. Emma's hand resumed its stroking pattern, moving from Ranger's ears down to his neck, then back up again. The repetitive motion seemed to soothe her, giving her something to focus on while she processed David's words. Outside the room, Sarah and Rosa exchanged glances. They both understood what David was doing, gently introducing the idea that Emma wasn't alone in her fear, that talking about scary things was something Ranger helped with, that it was okay to share her burden. "I saw something scary," Emma finally whispered, so quietly that David had to strain to hear her. "I know you did, sweetheart," David replied gently, "and I'm really sorry that happened to you. No one should have to see scary things, especially not kids." "Really scary," Emma emphasized, her small voice breaking slightly. Her grip on Ranger's fur tightened, and the dog responded by lifting his head slightly and giving her hand a gentle lick. The gesture was perfectly timed, as if Ranger could sense Emma's rising anxiety and wanted to comfort her. Emma looked down at Ranger with wide eyes, surprised by the lick. Then, for the first time in 3 months, the corners of her mouth lifted in the ghost of a smile. It was barely there, just the slightest upturn of her lips, but to everyone watching it was like seeing the sun break through storm clouds. "He kissed me," Emma whispered, and there was a trace of wonder in her voice. "He does that when he wants people to know he cares about them," David explained. "It's his way of saying, 'I'm here for you and you're safe with me.'" Emma looked at Ranger with an intensity that suggested she was truly seeing him for the first time, not just as a dog, but as a friend, an ally, a safe harbor in the storm of her trauma. "Can he hear my secrets?" she asked. David's breath caught. This was it, the opening they'd been desperately hopping for. "Ranger is very good at listening to secrets," he said carefully, "and he never ever tells anyone else. He just keeps them safe in his heart." "Never," Emma needed confirmation. "Never," David promised. "Ranger doesn't know how to talk to other people. He only knows how to listen and care." Emma considered this for a long moment, her hand continuing its soothing pattern through Ranger's fur. Then she leaned down, bringing her face close to Ranger's soft ear, and began to whisper. David couldn't hear what she was saying. Emma was speaking too quietly. Her words meant only for the dog, but he could see her lips moving, could see the way her body relaxed incrementally with each whispered sentence. Outside the room, Rosa's hand found Sarah's and squeezed tight. They stood together in silence, hardly daring to breathe, watching this breakthrough unfold. Emma talked to Ranger for 7 minutes straight. Sometimes she paused, gathering courage for the next part of her story. Sometimes tears rolled down her cheeks, and she'd bury her face in Ranger's neck until she could continue. But she talked. She finally talked. When Emma finished, she pulled back and looked into Ranger's eyes as if searching for judgment or rejection. The dog simply gazed back at her with his characteristic expression of infinite patience and acceptance. Then he licked her face, sweeping away her tears with his gentle tongue, and Emma did something miraculous. She giggled. It was a small sound, barely more than a breath, but it was genuine laughter. The sound of a child remembering, even just for a moment, what it felt like to be a child. David knew better than to ask Emma what she'd told Ranger. That would break the trust they were building, would remind her that this was ultimately about getting her to testify in court. Instead, he simply said, "Thank you for trusting Ranger with your secrets, Emma. That was very brave of you." Emma nodded solemnly, then asked, "Can Ranger come back tomorrow?" "Absolutely," David said, relief flooding through him. "Ranger would love to visit you again tomorrow, same time." "Same time," Emma agreed. Then, after a pause, she looked directly at David for the first time and added, "Can I bring him a treat?" David smiled. He would love that. His favorite treats are the peanut butter ones, but he likes pretty much anything. For the next 30 minutes, Emma continued to pet Ranger, occasionally whispering more secrets to him, sometimes just sitting in companionable silence. The dog never moved from his position at her feet, never showed any sign of impatience or restlessness. This was his job, and he was exceptional at it. When the session finally ended, Emma didn't want to let go of Ranger's leash. Rosa had to gently pry her granddaughter's fingers away, promising that they'd see Ranger again the very next day. Emma watched through the window as David led Ranger to his SUV, her nose pressed against the glass, her hand raised in a small wave. In the parking lot, Sarah caught up with David as he was loading Ranger into his vehicle. "That was incredible," she said, and her voice was thick with emotion. "In 3 months, dozens of professionals couldn't get through to her. Ranger did it in less than 2 hours." David scratched behind Ranger's ears and the dog leaned into his touch, tail wagging. "Ranger has a gift," he acknowledged. "But this is just the beginning, Sarah. Emma talked to Ranger, which is huge, but getting her to talk to us, to testify in court in front of strangers and her attacker, that's going to take time. We can't rush this." "The trial is in 12 days, Sarah reminded him, anxiety creeping into her voice. "I know," David said. "We'll come every day. We'll build on this progress. But Sarah, you need to understand, even if Emma starts talking to us, asking her to testify in court is asking for something enormous. The courtroom environment is terrifying for adults, let alone a traumatized 8-year-old. If we're going to make this work, we need to prepare her properly, and we need to get legal clearance for Ranger to be there with her." Sarah nodded, her mind already spinning with logistics. She'd need to talk to Ada Jennifer Park, would need to research legal precedents for facility dogs in courtrooms, would need to prepare for the inevitable fight with the defense attorney. But for the first time in 3 months, she had hope. Real, tangible hope. "Whatever you need," Sarah said. "Whatever Ranger needs. Whatever it takes to help Emma find her voice and put Marcus Webb away for what he did." David looked down at Ranger, who gazed back at him with those wise, gentle eyes. "We'll do our best," he promised. "Won't we, buddy?" Ranger's tail thumped against the car seat in agreement. As David drove away, Sarah stood in the parking lot, watching the sunset paint the Portland sky in shades of orange and pink. Somewhere in this city, Marcus Webb was preparing his defense, confident that a silent 8-year-old would never be able to testify against him. He had no idea that his biggest threat wasn't a witness who could speak. It was a witness who'd found her voice with the help of a remarkable dog. Inside the building, Emma sat with her grandmother, and for the first time in 3 months she was talking. Not about the attack yet, not about that terrible night, but about Ranger, his soft fur, his kind eyes, his gentle kiss. It was a start. And sometimes, Sarah thought, a start was all you needed. Tomorrow they would take the next step. Tomorrow, Emma would bring Ranger a peanut butter treat, and maybe, just maybe, she would share a few more of her secrets. And eventually, those secrets would become testimony. Those whispers would become evidence. And that evidence would become justice. But tonight, it was enough that Emma had spoken. After 3 months of silence, one word, soft, had opened a door. And on the other side of that door, a golden retriever named Ranger was waiting to guide a little girl back into the light. The next 10 days became a rhythm of small miracles and agonizing setbacks. Every afternoon at 2 o'clock, Officer David Chen would arrive at the Child Advocacy Center with Ranger, and Emma would be waiting by the window, her face pressed against the glass, watching for the golden retriever who had become her lifeline to the world. On day 2, Emma brought the promised peanut butter treats in a small plastic bag clutched tightly in her hand. She decorated the bag with stickers of hearts and stars, and when she gave Ranger the treats, carefully, one at a time, giggling when his gentle mouth tickled her palm, David saw Rosa Torres break down crying in the observation room. These were the sounds of childhood that had been stolen from Emma, now slowly being returned. By day 3, Emma was speaking in full sentences, though still only to Ranger. She told him about her favorite teacher, Mrs. Peterson, who always smelled like vanilla. She told him about her best friend, Sophia, who she hadn't seen since that night, because Emma couldn't bear to go back to school. She told him about how much she missed her mother's enchiladas and the way Mama would sing while cooking. "Why doesn't Mama sing anymore?" Emma whispered into Ranger's fur, and the question was so heartbreaking that David had to step out of the room for a moment to compose himself. On day 5, the breakthrough happened. Emma was sitting on the floor with Ranger, braiding a small section of his long fur while she talked about a dream she'd had. David was pretending to read emails on his phone, giving her the privacy she needed to feel safe. Then, unexpectedly, Emma looked up at him, direct eye contact that she'd been avoiding with all adults. "The bad man wore black gloves," she said, her voice trembling but clear. David's finger froze over his phone screen. He kept his voice carefully neutral. "Can you tell me more about that, Emma? Or you can tell Ranger and I can just listen." Emma looked back down at Ranger, gathering courage from the steady weight of his head in her lap. "It was nighttime. I was supposed to be sleeping, but I was reading with my flashlight under my blanket. I heard the crash, the window breaking." She paused, her fingers stilling in Ranger's fur. The dog shifted slightly, pressing more firmly against her, his way of providing support without words. "Mama screamed. I was so scared. I wanted to run to her, but I remembered what she always told me. If there's ever danger, hide first, then call 911. So I hid behind the couch. I had my phone, but I was too scared to call. I just watched." David's heart was pounding, but he remained perfectly still, letting Emma tell her story at her own pace. The man was big. He wore all black pants, black shirt, black jacket, and black gloves. He was yelling at Mama, saying he knew she had money, saying he'd watched her cash her check at the store. Mama said she didn't have any money, she'd paid bills, but he didn't believe her. Emma's breathing was becoming faster, more shallow. Ranger lifted his head and licked her face, and she wrapped her arms around his neck, anchoring herself. Mama tried to fight him. She grabbed a pan from the stove and swung it at him. That's when his mask came off. It got caught on Mama's bracelet and tore right off his face. This was it, the crucial moment. Emma had seen the attacker's face. David wanted to ask if she could describe him, if she could identify him, but he forced himself to wait. Pushing too hard now could cause Emma to retreat back into silence. "I saw him," Emma continued, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "I saw his face. He had mean eyes and a scar right here." She touched her own cheek, indicating a location. "He saw that his mask was off and he got so angry, that's when he grabbed the pipe." Emma's whole body began to shake. Ranger pressed closer and she buried her face in his fur, her words muffled but still audible. "He hit Mama, over and over. There was so much blood. I wanted to scream, wanted to help her, but I couldn't move. I was frozen. I couldn't save her." The last words came out as a sob, and then Emma was crying deep, wrenching cries that seemed to tear themselves from her chest. David moved closer but not too close, giving her space while still being present. "Emma," he said gently, "you were very, very brave. You survived, and you didn't freeze, you were smart. You stayed hidden and safe just like your mama taught you. That's not freezing, that's surviving. Your mama is alive because that man didn't find you. Do you understand that?" Emma looked up, her face streaked with tears, her eyes desperate for reassurance. "But I didn't help her. I didn't call 911 until after he left. I waited too long." "You called as soon as it was safe," David said firmly. "If you'd called while he was there, he might have heard you. He might have found you. You did exactly the right thing, Emma. You are not responsible for what that bad man did. He is. Only him." This was crucial, helping Emma understand that she wasn't to blame, that her child's mind in a moment of terror had done everything right, not everything wrong. Over the next few days, Emma continued to share pieces of her story with Ranger and, increasingly, with David too. She described how the attacker had finally left when he heard sirens in the distance. Someone else in the neighborhood had called 911 about the noise. She described calling for an ambulance, her mother's labored breathing, the terrifying wait for help to arrive. She described riding in the ambulance, her mother's blood on her hands, the fluorescent lights of the emergency room that hurt her eyes. By day 7, Emma was ready for the next crucial step. Detective Sarah Mitchell joined them in the interview room, sitting quietly in the corner while Emma talked. At first, Emma had reverted to whispering only to Ranger, but gradually, with Sarah's patient, gentle presence, she began to include the detective in her narrative. "Can you tell Detective Mitchell what you told me about the man's face?" David prompted gently. Emma looked at Ranger for courage, then turned to Sarah. "I saw him when the mask came off. I saw his whole face for maybe 10 seconds, but it felt longer. Everything felt like it was in slow motion." Sarah's voice was soft and encouraging. "That's very helpful, Emma. Could you describe what you saw?" "He was white, brown hair, kind of messy. The scar on his cheek was old, like a white line. His eyes were, I don't know the color, it was dark, but they were mean, really mean. And his nose was kind of crooked, like maybe it had been broken before." Sarah felt chills run down her spine. Emma's description matched Marcus Webb perfectly, including the scar from a knife fight years ago and the nose broken in a bar brawl. But having a description wasn't enough. They needed Emma to identify him definitively. On day 8, Sarah brought a photo lineup, 6 pictures of men with similar features, one of them Marcus Webb. Standard procedure, properly conducted to ensure no bias or suggestion. She spread the photos on the table in front of Emma. "Emma, I'm going to show you some pictures. These are just photos. These men aren't here, they can't hurt you. I want you to look at them carefully and tell me if any of these men is the person you saw that night. If you're not sure, or if he's not here, that's okay too. There's no pressure to pick someone. Do you understand?" Emma nodded, her hand finding Ranger's head again. She looked at the photos and David watched her face carefully. Her eyes scanned across them once, twice, then stopped. Her hand tightened in Ranger's fur, her breathing quickened. She was staring at photo number 4, Marcus Webb. "Is that him?" Emma whispered, not touching the photo as if it might burn her. "Which one, sweetheart?" Sarah asked gently. Emma pointed with a shaking finger at photo number 4. "That one. That's the bad man. That's him." Sarah felt triumph surge through her, but she kept her voice calm and professional. "You're sure? Take your time." "I'm sure," Emma said, and her voice was stronger now. "That's him. Those are his mean eyes. That's his scar. That's the man who hurt my mama." It was the identification they desperately needed. But Sarah knew it was just one piece of the puzzle. A photo identification was helpful, but what they really needed was for Emma to be able to make that identification in court, in person, with Marcus Webb sitting just feet away from her. The thought was terrifying. How could they ask this traumatized child to face her nightmare in a courtroom full of strangers? That evening, Sarah, David, and Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Park met in Jennifer's office to discuss strategy. The trial was now just 4 days away. "She identified him in the photo lineup," Jennifer said, reviewing Sarah's report. "That's admissible, but you know Kaufman will tear it apart. The child was coached, the identification was suggestive, she couldn't possibly remember clearly after all this trauma. We need her to testify in person." "She's not ready for that," David said firmly. "She's made incredible progress, but asking her to sit in a courtroom with Webb staring at her, with lawyers questioning her, with strangers watching." "I know it's asking a lot," Jennifer interrupted. "But without her testimony, we might lose this case. Webb's attorney is already filing motions to suppress evidence, arguing chain of custody issues with the fingerprints, claiming the boot prints are too common to be conclusive. Emma is our strongest evidence." "Then we need to make it possible for her to testify," Sarah said, "which means Ranger needs to be there with her." Jennifer leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. "Bringing a facility dog into court. Do you know how Kaufman will react? He'll claim it's prejudicial, that it unfairly influences the jury, that it's a sympathy play." "There's precedent," David said, pulling out a folder he'd prepared. "Washington State v. Dion, 2011, facility dog allowed with child witness. New York v. Toham, 2012, same thing. California has had facility dogs in over 100 trials. Courts have consistently ruled that they're a reasonable accommodation under victims' rights laws." Jennifer flipped through the cases David had compiled, her expression thoughtful. "Okay, I'll file a motion to allow Ranger to accompany Emma during testimony, but we need to prepare for a fight, and more importantly, we need to prepare Emma. Can you do that in 4 days?" David looked at Sarah, then back at Jennifer. "We can try, but I'm telling you right now, if Emma can't do this, if it's too much for her, we stop. I won't sacrifice this child's mental health for a conviction, no matter how much Webb deserves to go to prison." "Agreed," Jennifer said. "But let's give Emma every chance to tell her story. Let's give her the support she needs to face him. That's what justice looks like." Over the next 3 days, they worked with Emma in a mock courtroom setup, gradually introducing her to the environment she'd face. David brought Ranger every day, and slowly, carefully, they helped Emma build her courage. She practiced sitting in the witness box with Ranger at her feet. She practiced answering questions while David played the role of attorney. She practiced staying calm when Sarah sat across the room, pretending to be Marcus Webb. It was exhausting, emotional work. Emma had multiple panic attacks. She cried. She retreated into silence more than once. But each time Ranger was there, his steady presence, his gentle weight against her leg, his unwavering acceptance of her fear and pain. On the night before the trial, Emma looked at David with eyes that seemed far too old for her 8 years. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I know you are," David said. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the hard thing even when you are scared." Emma's hand found Ranger's fur, that familiar comfort that had brought her back from silence. "Will Ranger really be there? The whole time?" "The whole time," David promised. "Right beside you, I promise." Emma took a deep breath and nodded. "Okay, I can do this for Mama. I can tell them what I saw." As David drove home that night, Ranger asleep in the back seat, he said a silent prayer that Emma's courage would hold, that the judge would allow Ranger in the courtroom, and that tomorrow justice would finally be served. Tomorrow everything would change. Tomorrow the real battle would begin. The November morning arrived cold and gray, with rain clouds hanging low over Portland like a bruise. Emma Torres sat in the back seat of her grandmother's car, wearing the navy blue dress Rosa had carefully pressed the night before. Emma's small hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. She hadn't eaten breakfast despite Rosa's gentle insistence, hadn't spoken more than 3 words since waking up, and her eyes held the glassy, distant look of someone preparing for battle. "We're almost there, Mija," Rosa said softly, glancing at her granddaughter in the rearview mirror. "Officer Chen is meeting us at the back entrance with Ranger, just like he promised." At the mention of Ranger's name, Emma's expression flickered with something like hope. She'd barely slept, haunted by nightmares of the courtroom, of Marcus Webb's mean eyes staring at her, of her voice failing her at the crucial moment. But in every nightmare, when things became unbearable, Ranger appeared, solid, warm, real, and gave her the strength to continue. The Multnomah County Courthouse loomed ahead, its imposing stone facade making Emma's stomach clench with fear. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes pointing skyward like strange metal flowers. Word had leaked about the facility dog testimony, and the media had descended on the story with hungry enthusiasm. Headlines screamed from newspaper boxes, "Can a dog help justice?" Controversial courtroom companion sparks debate. An 8-year-old to testify with therapy dog in violent attack trial. Rosa parked in the reserved area and came around to open Emma's door. "Remember what we talked about, sweetheart. You just tell the truth. You just tell them what you saw. That's all anyone is asking." But Emma knew it was more complicated than that. She'd have to tell her truth while sitting just feet away from the man who'd nearly killed her mother. She'd have to speak clearly enough for a room full of strangers to hear. She'd have to answer questions from lawyers who might try to confuse her or make her doubt her own memories. The weight of it all pressed down on her small shoulders like a physical force. David Chen was waiting at the rear entrance, and beside him stood Ranger, his golden coat brushed to perfection, wearing his blue service vest with courthouse facility dog embroidered on the side. The moment Emma saw him, something inside her loosened slightly. She ran to him, dropping to her knees and burying her face in his fur. "Hey, buddy," she whispered, "I'm so glad you're here." Ranger's tail wagged slowly, and he pressed his head against Emma's chest, his way of saying, "I've got you. We'll do this together." David knelt down beside them. "How are you feeling, Emma?" "Scared," Emma admitted, her voice muffled against Ranger's neck. "Really, really scared." "That's okay. Scared is normal, but remember what we practiced. You've got Ranger right beside you. I'll be in the courtroom. Your grandma will be there. Detective Mitchell will be there. You're not alone in this." Inside the courthouse, Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Park was already engaged in a heated argument with defense attorney Robert Kaufman in Judge Margaret Whitfield's chambers. Kaufman, a silver-haired man in an expensive suit, was practically shouting, "Your Honor, this is outrageous. Bringing a dog into the courtroom is nothing more than a theatrical stunt designed to manipulate the jury's emotions. The moment they see that child with a cute dog, any objectivity goes out the window. They'll be making their decision based on sympathy, not evidence." Jennifer kept her voice level and professional. Your Honor, we're not asking for anything unconventional. 23 states have allowed facility dogs in courtrooms. These aren't pets. They're highly trained service animals that provide necessary accommodations for traumatized witnesses. Emma Torres has severe PTSD from witnessing a brutal attack on her mother. Without Ranger's support, she may not be able to testify at all. Under the Crime Victims' Rights Act, she's entitled to reasonable accommodations that allow her to participate in the judicial process. There's nothing reasonable about a prop designed to garner sympathy, Kaufman shot back. If the child can't testify without a dog, then perhaps her testimony isn't reliable enough to present. Judge Whitfield, a stern woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and no-nonsense demeanor, held up her hand for silence. She'd spent the weekend reviewing the legal precedents Jennifer had submitted, and she'd wrestled with this decision. On one hand, she understood Kaufman's concerns about jury prejudice. On the other hand, she'd read Emma's case file, had learned about the 3 months of selective mutism, had seen the psychological reports detailing the child's trauma. I've made my decision, Judge Whitfield said firmly. The facility dog will be permitted during Emma Torres' testimony, subject to strict conditions. The dog must remain at the witness's feet, out of the primary sight line of the jury. The dog must display no disruptive behavior whatsoever, no barking, whining, or movement that draws attention. Officer Chen must maintain control at all times. Any violation of these conditions, and the dog will be immediately removed from the courtroom. Furthermore, I'll instruct the jury that the dog is a trained service animal providing support to a witness, and that they should give it no more consideration than they would give to any other accommodation, such as a wheelchair or interpreter. Kaufman opened his mouth to protest further, but Judge Whitfield cut him off with a sharp look. My ruling stands, Counselor. If you'd like to appeal it, you may do so, but this trial proceeds as scheduled at 9 o'clock. We've delayed long enough. In the courthouse's victim services room, Emma sat on a couch with Ranger's head in her lap, trying to calm her racing heart. Detective Sarah Mitchell sat nearby, offering quiet encouragement. You've got this, Emma, just like we practiced. What if I forget? Emma whispered. What if I see him and I can't remember anything? Then we'll take a break, Sarah assured her. Judge Whitfield knows how hard this is for you. If you need time, just say so. But Emma, I believe in you. You're the bravest person I know. At 8:55 a.m., a bailiff knocked on the door. It's time. The walk to the courtroom felt endless. Emma's legs were shaking so badly that Rosa had to support her with one hand, while Emma clutched Ranger's leash with white-knuckled intensity. David walked on Emma's other side, his presence solid and reassuring. The courtroom was packed. Every seat in the gallery was filled with reporters, curious onlookers, and court watchers who'd heard about the unusual case. Emma could feel their eyes on her as she entered, and she wanted to run, to hide, to disappear. But Ranger pressed against her leg, his steady warmth anchoring her to the present moment. And then she saw him. Marcus Webb sat at the defense table, wearing a gray suit that made him look almost respectable. But Emma would have recognized him anywhere, the scar on his cheek, the crooked nose, and especially those eyes. Those mean, cold eyes that had haunted her nightmares for 3 months. The moment their gazes met, Emma's breath caught in her throat. She froze mid-step, her entire body going rigid with terror. Webb smiled slightly, a cruel, confident smile that said, I know you can't do this. Emma's vision started to narrow, black spots appearing at the edges. She was going to faint. She was going to run. She was going to. Ranger stopped walking and sat down directly in front of Emma, blocking her view of Webb. The dog looked up at her with those warm brown eyes, and Emma remembered what David had told her. When you're scared, look at Ranger. Not at Webb, not at the jury, not at the lawyers. Just look at Ranger and remember you're not alone. Emma took a shuddering breath and looked down at the golden retriever who'd given her back her voice. She could do this. She had to do this. For Mama, for justice, for herself. I'm okay, she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was telling Ranger David or herself. I can do this. They proceeded to the witness stand, a journey of maybe 20 feet that felt like 20 miles. Emma climbed into the witness box, her feet barely touching the floor, and Ranger settled at her feet exactly as they'd practiced. His warm weight pressed against her ankles, a constant reminder that she wasn't alone. Judge Whitfield's voice was gentle when she addressed Emma. "Good morning. Are you Emma Torres?" "Yes, ma'am," Emma managed, her voice barely audible. "Emma, you're going to need to speak up so everyone can hear you. Can you do that?" Emma nodded, then remembered she needed to speak. "Yes, ma'am, I'll try." "That's all anyone can ask. Now, do you promise to tell the truth today?" "I promise." The courtroom fell silent as Jennifer Park approached the witness stand. She gave Emma an encouraging smile. "Hi, Emma. I know this is scary, but you're doing great. I'm just going to ask you some questions, okay? If you need a break at any time, you just let me know." Emma's hand dropped down to touch Ranger's head, drawing strength from his presence. "Okay. Can you tell us what happened on the night of October 15th? And so it began. Emma's voice was soft at first, so quiet that Judge Whitfield had to ask her twice to speak up. But as she continued, as she felt Ranger's steady breathing against her legs and saw the encouraging faces of David and Sarah in the courtroom, her voice grew stronger. She described the crash of breaking glass, her mother's screams, hiding behind the couch. She described the man in black, his angry demands, the fight that ensued. Her testimony was halting, emotional, punctuated by tears and long pauses where she had to gather her courage. But she was doing it. She was telling her story. Jennifer was patient, guiding Emma through the narrative without leading or suggesting. When Emma described the moment the mask came off, revealing the attacker's face, you could have heard a pin drop in the courtroom. "And did you see his face clearly, Emma?" "Yes, for like 10 seconds, maybe a little more." "Can you describe what you saw?" Emma described the scar, the crooked nose, the mean eyes, details that matched Marcus Webb perfectly. Several jurors leaned forward in their seats, completely absorbed in this child's testimony. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Jennifer approached the witness stand with a photograph, the booking photo of Marcus Webb. "Emma, I'm going to show you a picture. Can you tell me if this is the person you saw that night?" Emma looked at the photo, and her whole body tensed. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, her hands gripping the edge of the witness box so hard her knuckles turned white. For a terrifying moment, Sarah thought Emma might shut down completely, might retreat back into the silence that had protected her for so long. But then something remarkable happened. Ranger, who had been perfectly still throughout the testimony, lifted his head. He didn't stand, didn't move from his position, but he pressed his head firmly against Emma's leg, a gentle reminder, "I'm here. You're safe. You can do this." Emma's hand found Ranger's head, her fingers digging into his soft fur. She looked at the photograph, then raised her eyes to look directly at Marcus Webb sitting at the defense table. Their gazes locked, the traumatized child and the violent criminal who destroyed her sense of safety. And in that moment, Emma made a choice. She would not let fear win. She would not let this man take anything else from her or her mother. She had already lost 3 months to silence. She refused to lose anything more. Emma released the witness box with one hand and pointed directly at Marcus Webb, her arm extended, her finger steady and unwavering. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and strong, loud enough for everyone in the courtroom to hear, including the man who tried to silence her family forever. "That's HIM." The 2 words rang through the courtroom like a bell, and in that instant everything changed. The courtroom held its collective breath as Emma's accusation hung in the air. Her small arm remained extended, finger pointing directly at Marcus Webb with unwavering certainty. "That's HIM," she repeated, her voice cracking with emotion but gaining strength with each syllable. "That's the bad man who hurt my mama. Jennifer Park felt a surge of triumph but maintained her professional composure. "Let the record show that the witness has identified the defendant, Marcus Webb," she said clearly. "Emma, are you absolutely certain?" "I'm certain," Emma said, her voice steadier now, her hand finding Ranger's head again for support. "I saw his face. I'll never forget it. Never." At the defense table, Marcus Webb's confident smirk had vanished. He leaned toward his attorney, Robert Kaufman, whispering urgently. Kaufman's face had gone pale. This was not going the way he'd expected. He'd been certain that Emma would crumble under pressure, that her testimony would be too fragile to withstand scrutiny. What happened next would become the most talked-about moment in Portland courtroom history. As Emma continued to point at Webb, something shifted in the atmosphere of the room. Ranger, who had been lying perfectly still at Emma's feet throughout her testimony, suddenly stood up. There had been no command from Officer David Chen, no signal, no cue. The dog simply rose to his feet, his body language transforming in an instant. David's eyes widened in shock. In 18 months of working together, through dozens of victim interviews and practice sessions, Ranger had never done anything without a command. The dog was trained to remain motionless during testimony, to be an unobtrusive source of comfort. This was completely unprecedented. Ranger moved with deliberate purpose, positioning himself between Emma and the defense table. His ears, which had been relaxed and soft throughout the testimony, suddenly pricked forward, alert and focused. His tail, which had been gently swaying, went still. His entire body oriented toward Marcus Webb with an intensity that made everyone in the courtroom take notice. Then, barely audible but unmistakable in the silent courtroom, a low growl emerged from deep in Ranger's chest. "Objection!" Robert Kaufman shot to his feet so quickly his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Your Honor, this is exactly the kind of prejudicial display I warned about. This animal is clearly trained to react this way to create sympathy and bias the jury against my client." Judge Whitfield banged her gavel, her face stern. "Order! Officer Chen, control your animal immediately." David was already moving forward, as shocked as anyone by Ranger's behavior. "Ranger, sit," he commanded firmly. The dog hesitated, another first, then slowly sat, though his eyes never left Marcus Webb. His body remained tense, protective, positioned between Emma and the man she'd identified. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Jurors leaned toward each other, murmuring. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Rosa Torres had her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "Your Honor," Kaufman pressed, his voice rising, "I move for an immediate mistrial. This display was clearly orchestrated to prejudice the jury. The dog's aggressive behavior toward my client creates an assumption of guilt that—" "The dog wasn't aggressive," Jennifer Park interrupted, standing to address the judge. "He positioned himself protectively, which is consistent with his training to comfort and shield trauma victims. He didn't bark, didn't lunge, didn't attack. He simply moved to provide additional support to a frightened child witness." "He growled at my client," Kaufman shot back. "Perhaps your client should ask himself why a dog trained to comfort trauma victims would react that way," Jennifer retorted. "Enough," Judge Whitfield's voice cut through the chaos. Both counsel approached the bench now. As the attorneys hurried forward for a sidebar conference, David knelt beside Ranger, checking the dog carefully. Ranger's attention was still locked on Webb, his body language screaming, threat detected, in a way David had only seen during advanced protection training scenarios that Ranger had observed but wasn't certified for. "What happened, buddy?" David whispered, running his hands over the dog to check for any signs of distress or illness. "You've never done that before." Emma, still in the witness box, had wrapped both arms around herself, but her eyes were on Ranger with something like wonder. The dog had stood up for her, literally. In that moment when she'd been most vulnerable, when she'd pointed at her attacker and made herself a target of his hatred, Ranger had physically put himself between her and danger. At the bench, Judge Whitfield listened to both attorneys argue their positions. Kaufman was demanding a mistrial, claiming the dog's behavior had irreparably tainted the jury. Jennifer was arguing that Ranger's protective response actually validated Emma's testimony. The dog had sensed genuine threat and responded appropriately. "Your Honor," Jennifer added, pulling out her phone, "I'd like to call a recess to consult with a K-9 behavioral specialist. I believe there's a scientific explanation for what just happened, and the court should hear it before making any decisions about mistrial." Judge Whitfield looked at the circus her courtroom had become, then at Emma Torres, still sitting bravely in the witness box, one hand extended down to touch Ranger's head. The child had shown extraordinary courage in facing her attacker. Whatever had just happened with the dog, Whitfield wasn't going to let it derail this testimony. "Motion for mistrial is denied," she announced, and Kaufman's face turned red with anger. "However, we will take a 30-minute recess. Ms. Park, if you can get your behavioral expert here in that time, I'll hear testimony about what we just witnessed. But be warned, if I determine this was in any way orchestrated, there will be serious consequences." "Thank you, Your Honor," Jennifer said, already texting frantically. The jury was escorted out, still buzzing with confused conversation. Emma was led back to the victim services room with Rosa, David, and Ranger. The moment they were alone, Emma threw her arms around Ranger's neck. "You protected me," she whispered. "Thank you, Ranger, thank you." David was on his phone with Dr. Patricia Yamamoto, a renowned K-9 behavioral specialist who happened to be in Portland for a conference. She'd actually been in the courtroom gallery, observing the historic testimony, and had witnessed Ranger's unusual behavior firsthand. "I can be there in 10 minutes, Dr. Yamamoto said. "And David, what I saw was fascinating. I have some theories, but I need to see the dog and observe him near the defendant again." Meanwhile, in a courthouse bathroom, Marcus Webb splashed cold water on his face while Kaufman paced behind him. "What the hell was that?" Kaufman demanded. "Did you do something to provoke that dog?" "I didn't do anything," Webb snarled. "I was just sitting there. That cop probably trained the dog to react to me, planted my scent or something. This whole thing is a setup." But there was something in Webb's eyes, a flicker of genuine fear, because he'd seen the way that dog looked at him, and it had triggered a primal response. Animals could sense things humans couldn't, and that golden retriever had looked at him like he was a threat worth guarding against. When court reconvened, Dr. Patricia Yamamoto took the stand. She was a petite woman with gray-streaked hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. After being sworn in and her credentials established, she had a PhD in animal behavior and had published over 50 papers on K-9 cognition and training. Jennifer began her questions. "Dr. Yamamoto, you were present in the courtroom and witnessed the facility dog's behavior. Can you explain to the court what you observed?" "Yes." Ranger displayed what we call protective positioning combined with a low-level threat alert. This behavior was not in response to any command I could observe. It appeared to be an autonomous decision by the dog based on environmental cues he was processing. "Can you explain what those environmental cues might have been?" Dr. Yamamoto nodded. Facility dogs like Ranger are trained to detect and respond to human stress markers, elevated heart rate, stress hormones in sweat, changes in breathing patterns. But they're also capable of detecting threat markers, pheromones associated with aggression, predatory body language, and other subtle signals that humans might miss. "Are you suggesting the dog detected something threatening about Mr. Webb?" "Objection," Kaufman jumped up. "Speculation and prejudicial." "Your Honor, this is expert testimony about animal behavior," Jennifer countered. "I'll allow it, but be careful where you're going with this, Ms. Park," Judge Whitfield warned. Dr. Yamamoto continued. What I observed was a dog trained primarily for comfort and support, displaying behaviors consistent with detecting a genuine threat. Ranger positioned himself between the child and the person she identified as her attacker. This wasn't trained behavior. This was instinctive protection based on the dog's assessment of the situation. Could this behavior have been trained or rehearsed? Extremely unlikely. Protective behaviors like this would actually conflict with Ranger's primary training, which emphasizes remaining calm and still. For him to override that training suggests he perceived a genuine and immediate threat to his charge. Kaufman's cross-examination was aggressive. "Dr. Yamamoto, isn't it true that dogs can be trained to respond to all sorts of subtle cues from their handlers? A gesture, a sound, even a scent?" "Yes, but I was watching Officer Chen closely. He appeared as surprised as everyone else." Appeared being the operative word. You can't say with certainty that no signal was given. No scientific observation can claim absolute certainty about human intent, Dr. Yamamoto conceded. But as an expert in K9 behavior with 30 years of experience, I can say that what I witnessed appeared to be genuine autonomous protective response, not a trained performance. The testimony continued for another 20 minutes, with Kaufman trying to poke holes in Dr. Yamamoto's conclusions and Jennifer reinforcing the legitimacy of Ranger's behavior. Finally, Judge Whitfield had heard enough. "Here's my ruling," she announced. "The dog's behavior, whatever caused it, is not evidence against the defendant. However, it's also not grounds for a mistrial. The jury will be instructed to disregard the dog's reaction and focus solely on the witness's testimony and identification. We will continue with cross-examination of Emma Torres." Emma returned to the witness stand, her hand immediately finding Ranger's head as the dog settled back at her feet. Kaufman approached, and everyone in the courtroom tensed, wondering how the defense attorney would handle this fragile witness who had just definitively identified his client. Kaufman's strategy became immediately clear. He would try to undermine Emma's memory and perception without appearing to bully a traumatized child. "Emma, that was a very scary night, wasn't it?" "Yes, sir." "And you were hiding, frightened, probably crying." "I was trying not to cry. I didn't want him to hear me." "So you were very focused on being quiet and staying hidden. Is that fair to say?" Emma hesitated, sensing a trap but not sure where it was. Yes, I guess so." "And it was dark, wasn't it? You said it was nighttime." "The kitchen light was on." "But you were in the living room behind the couch in shadows, correct?" "Yes, but I could see." "And this all happened very fast, didn't it? You said the mask came off during a struggle. Everything was moving chaotic." Emma's breathing quickened. Ranger shifted slightly, pressing more firmly against her leg. "It went fast, but I saw his face. I know what I saw." "Emma, isn't it possible that in all that fear and chaos and darkness, you might have made a mistake? That your memory might have?" "I didn't make a mistake." Emma's voice rose, surprising everyone including herself. "I saw him. I see his face every night when I close my eyes. I see it in nightmares. I know who hurt my mama, and it's him." She pointed at Webb again, her whole body shaking but her finger steady. "That's the bad man. That's him." The courtroom fell silent. Even Kaufman seemed taken aback by the intensity of Emma's conviction. He glanced at the jury and saw their faces. They believed her. This traumatized child, supported by her facility dog, was credible in a way no amount of legal maneuvering could undermine. "No further questions," Kaufman said quietly, returning to his seat. Judge Whitfield looked at Emma with something like admiration. "You did very well, Emma. You're excused. Thank you for your courage." As Emma left the witness stand, Ranger walked beside her and the courtroom erupted in spontaneous applause, something Judge Whitfield would normally never allow, but this time she let it continue. Emma had done the impossible. She had faced her nightmare and spoken her truth. And somehow, A golden retriever named Ranger had known exactly when she needed him to stand up and be more than just a comfort animal, to be a protector, a guardian, a living shield between a frightened child and the monster who haunted her dreams. The moment would be analyzed, debated, and discussed for years to come. But in that courtroom on that gray November day, everyone present understood they had witnessed something extraordinary, not just testimony, but transformation. A little girl finding her voice, a dog transcending his training to protect his charge. And two words, that's him. That would change everything. The jury deliberation room on the third floor of the Multnomah County Courthouse was thick with tension. 12 men and women sat around a large conference table, the weight of their responsibility pressing down on them like a physical force. It had been 6 hours since they'd retired to consider the evidence against Marcus Webb, and the debate had been intense, emotional, and at times heated. "Let's go through it one more time," said Juror 3, Margaret Chen, a high school science teacher who'd been elected foreperson by unanimous vote. She adjusted her glasses and looked around the table at her fellow jurors. "We all agree the circumstantial evidence is strong, fingerprints, boot prints, fiber evidence. But the defense raised valid questions about each of those pieces. What keeps coming back to is Emma Torr's testimony." "That little girl was telling the truth," declared Juror 7, Robert Jameson, a retired Marine with a gray crew cut. "I've seen enough liars in my life to know when someone's being honest. She looked that monster right in the eye and identified him. No hesitation." "But she was traumatized," countered Juror 11, Sarah Patel, a software engineer who'd been the most skeptical throughout the trial. "Memory is unreliable under stress. We learned that in psychology class." The defense attorney made good points about the darkness, the chaos, the fear affecting her perception. "Are we going to talk about the dog?" Juror 5, James Rodriguez, finally asked what several others were thinking. "Because I know the judge told us to disregard it, but I can't stop thinking about what happened." Judge Whitfield had given explicit instructions. The jury was to consider only the evidence presented, not the facility dog's behavior. But as much as they tried to follow those instructions, every person in that room had witnessed Ranger's unprecedented reaction, and it had lodged itself in their minds like a splinter. "The judge said we can't use that as evidence," Margaret reminded them firmly. "I know what the judge said," James responded. "But I'm a veterinarian. I work with animals every day. What that dog did, that wasn't trained behavior. That was genuine threat detection. Dogs have senses we don't. They can smell fear, aggression, danger. That golden retriever sensed something about Webb." "That's speculation," Sarah insisted. "We can't convict a man because a dog growled at him." "We're not convicting him because of the dog," Robert shot back. "We're convicting him because an 8-year-old girl who had no reason to lie identified him as the man who nearly killed her mother. The dog just confirmed what we all felt watching that testimony. That little girl was telling the truth." "But is that reasonable doubt?" Sarah pressed. "The defense attorney is right. Memory can be unreliable. What if she's wrong? What if we send an innocent man to prison?" "Innocent?" Juror 2, Patricia Okonkwo, a nurse, spoke up for the first time in an hour. "Did you see his face when Emma pointed at him? Did you see the way he looked at her? That wasn't the face of an innocent man wrongly accused. That was the face of someone who knew he'd been caught." "Body language isn't evidence either," Sarah reminded them. The debate continued, voices rising and falling, arguments being made and rebutted. They reviewed the evidence boards that had been sent with them, photographs of the crime scene, the broken window, Maria Torr's injuries documented in stark, clinical detail. They read through Emma's testimony transcript, her words describing that terrible night. "I keep coming back to the details," Margaret said, tapping the transcript. She described the scar on his cheek, the crooked nose, the mean eyes, the black gloves. Every single detail matched Webb. How could she know those things if she didn't see him? "The scar and nose were in his booking photo," Sarah countered. She could have seen pictures before. She was kept completely separate from any information about suspects. Juror 9, Linda Washington, a paralegal, interjected. I work in law. I know how witness identification procedures work. They followed protocol perfectly. 6 photos, standard lineup, no suggestion. Emma picked Webb without hesitation. Another hour passed. Coffee was consumed, sandwiches barely touched. The weight of decision hung heavy in the air. They were deciding a man's fate, determining whether he would spend the next 25 years in prison or walk free. It was a responsibility none of them took lightly. Let's vote again, Margaret finally suggested. Secret ballot just like before. 12 pieces of paper were distributed. 12 people wrote their verdicts in private. Margaret collected them, unfolded them one by one, and announced the results. Guilty, 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 not guilty, guilty. 11-1. Sarah was the holdout and everyone knew it. Talk to us, Sarah, Margaret said gently. What's holding you back? Sarah's eyes were shining with tears. I keep thinking, what if we're wrong? What if that little girl is mistaken? Memory is so fragile, trauma changes things. What if we ruin an innocent man's life? What about Maria Torres' life? Patricia asked softly. She's in a wheelchair because of what this man did. She has headaches every day, memory problems, can't work anymore. And Emma, that little girl, hasn't spoken in 3 months because of what she witnessed. If we let Webb walk free, what does that say to them? That their pain doesn't matter. That justice doesn't exist. But justice means being sure, Sarah insisted, beyond a reasonable doubt. Is your doubt reasonable, though? James asked. Or is it just fear of making a mistake? Because those are 2 different things. I have doubts about lots of things in life. That doesn't make them reasonable doubts. Robert leaned forward, his voice gruff but gentle. Sarah, I was in combat. I know what trauma looks like. I know what truth looks like too. That little girl was traumatized, yes, but she was also absolutely certain. She didn't waver, didn't hesitate, didn't doubt herself even when the defense attorney tried to shake her. She knew. And deep down, I think you know too. The room fell silent. Sarah stared at the evidence photos spread across the table, Maria Torres in the hospital, her face swollen and bruised beyond recognition. Emma's drawing from therapy sessions, dark scribbles of a figure looming over a smaller one. The broken window, the blood-stained kitchen floor, the pipe that had been used as a weapon. The dog knew, Linda said quietly. I know we're not supposed to consider it, but we all saw it. That dog knew. Maybe dogs know things we don't, James added. Maybe they can sense guilt or danger or evil. Maybe Ranger smelled something, stress hormones, aggression markers, I don't know. But what I do know is that dog had been perfectly calm all through that testimony until Emma pointed at Webb. Then something changed. The dog sensed a threat. Or maybe, Patricia suggested, the dog just knew Emma was afraid and positioned himself to protect her. And maybe that's all we need to know. That little girl was afraid, identified her attacker, and a trained facility dog confirmed that her fear was real and justified. Margaret looked at Sarah with understanding. No one wants to make a mistake, but sometimes doing nothing is also a mistake. Sometimes letting a guilty man go free causes more harm than convicting an innocent man. And I don't believe Webb is innocent, not with all this evidence, not with Emma's testimony, not with what we all saw in that courtroom. Sarah closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and thought about everything she'd heard over the past 3 days. The testimony, the evidence, Emma's small, brave voice saying that's him. Ranger standing up, positioning himself between a frightened child and the man who'd hurt her family. She thought about reasonable doubt. Was it reasonable to doubt Emma's identification? Or was she just being overly cautious, so afraid of making a mistake that she was willing to ignore the overwhelming evidence of Webb's guilt? Finally, Sarah opened her eyes. Okay, she said softly, I'm ready to vote again. Margaret distributed new ballots. This time when she counted them, her voice was steady and clear. Guilty, 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 guilty. 12-0, unanimous. The jury filed back into the courtroom at 4:17 p.m., their faces solemn. Emma sat in the gallery with her grandmother, Officer Chen, and Ranger. She'd been allowed to stay for the verdict, though everyone had warned her it might take days. 6 hours had felt like a lifetime. Marcus Webb stood as the jury entered, his face a mask of forced confidence. But Emma could see the fear in his eyes, the same mean eyes that had haunted her dreams, now filled with the beginning of understanding that his arrogance had been misplaced. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Whitfield asked. "We have, Your Honor," Margaret Chen replied, standing with the verdict form in her trembling hands. "On the count of home invasion with a deadly weapon, how do you find?" "We find the defendant, Marcus Webb, guilty." Emma gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Rosa pulled her close, tears streaming down both their faces. "On the count of assault with intent to commit great bodily harm, how do you find?" "Guilty." "On the count of armed robbery, how do you find?" "Guilty." With each guilty verdict, Webb's face grew paler, his confident facade crumbling. By the time Margaret finished reading all the counts, 5 in total, all guilty, he was gripping the defense table for support. The courtroom erupted. Judge Whitfield had to bang her gavel repeatedly for order, but she didn't stop the smattering of applause that broke out, didn't silence the quiet sobs of relief from the victims' advocates section. Emma buried her face in Ranger's fur, her whole body shaking with emotion. It was over. The bad man would go to prison. He couldn't hurt anyone else. She had done it, she had found her voice, told her truth, and justice had been served. Detective Sarah Mitchell sat in the back row, tears running down her face as she watched Emma celebrate her victory. 3 months ago, this child couldn't speak at all. Now she had spoken truth to power and won. It was the most beautiful moment of Sarah's 15-year career. Judge Whitfield scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later, then addressed the courtroom. "Before we adjourn, I want to say something." She looked directly at Emma. "Young lady, you showed extraordinary courage today. You faced your fear and spoke your truth. You are a remarkable person, and I hope you know how proud everyone in this courtroom is of you." Emma looked up at the judge, her tear-stained face breaking into a smile, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from her since before the attack. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said clearly. "I couldn't have done it without Ranger." The golden retriever, sitting quietly beside her, thumped his tail against the floor as if he understood the praise. David Chen reached down to scratch behind his partner's ears, his own eyes wet with tears. They had done it. Together, they had helped a traumatized child find justice. As the courtroom cleared, Jennifer Park approached Emma and Rosa. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for being so brave." "Will the bad man really go to prison?" Emma asked, needing confirmation. "Yes, sweetheart," Jennifer promised. "For a very, very long time. He'll never hurt you or your mother again." Emma nodded, satisfied. Then she looked up at Officer Chen. "Can I keep visiting Ranger, even though the trial is over?" David's smile was warm. "Absolutely. Ranger would love that. He's gotten pretty attached to you too." As they left the courthouse that evening, the gray skies had finally cleared. Sunset painted Portland in shades of orange and gold, and Emma walked between her grandmother and Officer Chen, one hand holding Rosa's, the other resting on Ranger's head. Behind them, Marcus Webb was being led away in handcuffs, his mean eyes finally defeated. Ahead of them lay healing, recovery, and a future where Emma could learn to be a child again. 2 words, "That's him," had changed everything. And a dog's instinctive protection had confirmed what everyone needed to know. Sometimes truth needs no more evidence than a child's clear voice and a golden retriever's unwavering devotion. Justice, it turned out, sometimes walks on 4 paws and has the warmest brown eyes you've ever seen. 3 weeks later, the Multnomah County Courthouse was packed once again, but the atmosphere was different from the tense trial days. Today was sentencing day, and there was a sense of closure in the air, mixed with anticipation of the final chapter in this remarkable case. Marcus Webb stood before Judge Margaret Whitfield in an orange prison jumpsuit, his hands shackled, his confident smirk long gone. The man who had terrorized a family and tried to silence a little girl now looked small and defeated. His attorney, Robert Kaufman, stood beside him, knowing there was little he could argue at this point. The jury had spoken. Justice demanded its due. "Mr. Webb," Judge Whitfield began, her voice carrying the weight of authority, "you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers on 5 counts. Home invasion with a deadly weapon, assault with intent to commit great bodily harm, armed robbery, use of a weapon in the commission of a felony, and infliction of severe bodily injury. Before I pass sentence, does the victim wish to make a statement?" All eyes turned to the gallery where Maria Torres sat in her wheelchair, Emma beside her holding her mother's hand. Maria had come so far in 3 months, through surgeries, physical therapy, and the long road of recovery. She could walk short distances now with a cane, but the wheelchair was still necessary for longer periods. The headaches persisted, and doctors said some of her cognitive issues might be permanent. But she was alive, and she was here to see justice served. Rosa wheeled Maria forward to the microphone that had been set up in front of the judge's bench. Emma walked beside them, and notably, Officer David Chen stood nearby with Ranger. The facility dog had become such an integral part of Emma's healing that Judge Whitfield had made the extraordinary decision to allow him in court for this final proceeding. Maria's hands trembled as she gripped the microphone, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Your Honor, my name is Maria Torres, and I am the victim of this man's violence. On October 15th, Marcus Webb broke into my home, attacked me with a metal pipe, and left me for dead on my kitchen floor. He fractured my skull, broke 3 ribs, and caused a traumatic brain injury that has changed my life forever." Emma squeezed her mother's hand, drawing strength from Ranger's presence at her feet. "But the worst thing he did," Maria continued, her voice breaking, "was what he did to my daughter. Emma saw everything that night. For 3 months she couldn't speak because of the trauma. My beautiful, chatty, singing little girl went silent. He stole her voice, her childhood, her sense of safety. He gave her nightmares that still wake her up screaming." Tears streamed down Maria's face, but she kept speaking. "I want you to understand the full scope of what this man destroyed. I lost my job because I can't do the physical work anymore. We lost our home because we couldn't pay rent. My daughter lost 3 months of school, lost her friends, lost the ability to just be a kid. We live with my sister now, and every day is a struggle, physically, financially, emotionally." Marcus Webb stared at the floor, refusing to meet Maria's eyes. "But he didn't break us," Maria said, her voice growing stronger. "Because my Emma found her courage. With the help of an amazing dog named Ranger and officers who never gave up on us, Emma found her voice again. She stood in this courtroom and pointed at this man and said, 'That's him.' And she was right. She was so right." Maria paused, wiping her tears. "Your Honor, I'm not a vengeful person, but I am asking you to give this man the maximum sentence allowed by law, not just for what he did to me, but for what he tried to take from my daughter. He tried to silence her through fear, and he failed. Let this sentence be a message that violence against families will not be tolerated, that terrorizing children has consequences, and that justice exists for people like us, working people, immigrant families, single mothers just trying to survive." The courtroom was silent except for the sound of quiet crying from several observers. Judge Whitfield nodded solemnly. "Thank you, Ms. Torres. Your courage and your daughter's courage has been an inspiration to this court. Would Emma like to say anything?" Everyone looked at Emma, not expecting her to speak. But the little girl, who 3 months ago couldn't utter a single word, stepped forward to the microphone. Her hand found Ranger's head, and the dog pressed against her leg in that familiar gesture of support. "My name is Emma Marie Torres," she began, her voice small but clear. "I'm 8 years old, and I used to be really scared of everything. I was scared of the dark, scared of loud noises, scared of strangers, but mostly I was scared of him." She looked directly at Marcus Webb for the first time. "I was scared that if I told what I saw, he would come back and hurt me too." Emma's voice grew steadier. "But then I met Ranger, and Ranger taught me that being scared is okay, but staying silent isn't. He taught me that I could be brave even when I was afraid. He stood beside me when I had to point at the bad man and tell the truth. He even stood in front of me to protect me." Several jurors who had returned to watch the sentencing wiped their eyes, remembering that extraordinary moment when Ranger had positioned himself between Emma and Webb. "I'm not scared anymore," Emma declared, and her voice rang with newfound confidence. "Because the bad man is going to prison and I got my voice back. I want other kids who are scared to know that it's okay to tell the truth. It's okay to be brave. And sometimes the best friends who help you be brave have 4 legs and fur." She looked up at Judge Whitfield. "Thank you for letting Ranger be with me. Thank you for listening to me. And please make sure the bad man can never hurt anyone else's mama ever again." Emma stepped back and the courtroom erupted in applause. This time Judge Whitfield didn't even try to stop it. She let it continue for a full minute, honoring the courage of this remarkable child. When order was restored, Judge Whitfield turned her attention to Marcus Webb. "Mr. Webb, do you have anything to say before I pass sentence?" Webb's attorney whispered urgently in his ear, but Webb shook his head. He had nothing to say, no remorse to express, no apology to offer. His silence spoke volumes about his character. "Very well," Judge Whitfield said, her voice taking on the formal tone of judgment. "Marcus Webb, you have been convicted of heinous crimes against an innocent family. You broke into their home, brutally attacked a woman who was simply trying to provide for her child, and traumatized an 8-year-old girl in ways that will affect her for the rest of her life. You showed no mercy, no remorse, and no humanity." The judge paused, letting her words sink in. "This court has heard testimony about the physical injuries you inflicted, the financial devastation you caused, and the psychological trauma that continues to this day. But we've also heard testimony about something else, about courage, about resilience, and about the power of healing." Judge Whitfield looked at Emma. "That little girl faced you in this courtroom and spoke truth with a clarity and conviction that many adults lack. She did what you tried to make impossible. She found her voice and used it to ensure justice." Turning back to Webb, her expression hardened. "The law allows me to sentence you to up to 30 years in prison. Given the severity of your crimes, your criminal history, and your complete lack of remorse, I am sentencing you to 25 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for 20 years. Additionally, you will be required to pay restitution to the Torres family in the amount of $250,000 for medical expenses, lost wages, and pain and suffering." Webb's knees buckled slightly, and his attorney had to support him. 25 years. He would be an old man when he got out if he survived prison at all. "Furthermore," Judge Whitfield continued, "when and if you are released, you will be subject to a lifetime restraining order prohibiting you from any contact with the Torres family. You will also be required to register as a violent offender. Take him away." As bailiffs led Marcus Webb out of the courtroom, he finally looked back at Emma one last time. But the little girl who had once hidden behind the couch in terror now stood tall, her hand on Ranger's head, meeting his gaze without fear. Webb looked away first, defeated. The courtroom cleared slowly, people stopping to congratulate Maria and Emma, to thank Officer Chen and Ranger, to celebrate a justice system that, at least this once, had worked the way it was supposed to. 6 months after the sentencing, life had begun to return to a new normal for the Torres family. Maria had recovered enough to take a desk job at a community center, work that didn't require the physical labor her body could no longer handle. Emma had returned to school, where she'd become something of a celebrity, the brave girl who testified with her therapy dog. But more importantly, Emma had found a new purpose. She and Officer Chen had begun visiting other children who'd experienced trauma, bringing Ranger along to show them that healing was possible, that voices could be found even after the darkest silence. On a sunny spring afternoon, Emma stood before the Oregon State Legislature in Salem, testifying in support of House Bill 2017, a proposed law that would establish a statewide courthouse facility dog program and provide funding for training and placement of therapy dogs throughout the justice system. "My name is Emma Torres," she began, standing at a podium that was almost too tall for her, speaking into a microphone before dozens of legislators. Ranger sat beside her, wearing his service vest, as calm and supportive as ever. "And I'm here to tell you that courthouse facility dogs save lives. They saved mine." Emma told her story, not all the terrible details, but enough to convey the trauma she'd experienced and the healing Ranger had made possible. She spoke clearly, confidently, without the hesitation that had once characterized every word. "There are other kids like me out there right now," Emma concluded. "Kids who saw bad things happen, kids who are too scared to talk about it, kids who need justice but can't find their voice. Ranger gave me my voice back. He helped me be brave when I wanted to hide. He stood beside me when I had to face my worst fear. And now I'm asking you to help other kids have the same chance I had." She looked around at the legislators, many of whom were visibly moved. "Please pass this bill. Please give more kids a Ranger of their own, because every child deserves to feel safe. Every child deserves to be heard. And sometimes the best way to help them find their voice is with a friend who has 4 paws and a heart full of love." The chamber erupted in applause. Several legislators stood, giving Emma a standing ovation. And beside her, Ranger's tail thumped against the floor, as if he understood that this was important, that they were doing something that mattered. The bill passed unanimously 2 weeks later, with Emma present to watch the final vote. Governor Catherine Brown signed it into law in a public ceremony, with Emma and Ranger standing beside her as she put pen to paper. "This law will be known as Emma's Law," the governor announced, "and it will ensure that other children have access to the support that made Emma's testimony possible. Today, we recognize that justice isn't just about laws and procedures. It's about compassion, healing, and giving victims the tools they need to speak their truth." 1 year after that terrible October night, Emma and her mother attended a ribbon-cutting ceremony at the Portland Child Advocacy Center. A new wing had been built, specifically designed for working with traumatized children, and at its entrance stood a bronze statue, a little girl with her hand resting on the head of a golden retriever. The plaque beneath read, "In honor of Emma Torres and Ranger, whose courage changed the face of justice, may all who enter here find their voice and their healing." Emma stood before the statue, tears streaming down her face, with the real Ranger sitting beside her. Officer Chen put his hand on her shoulder. "You did this, Emma. You changed things. How does it feel?" Emma thought about the question seriously. She thought about the nightmares that still sometimes came, but less frequently now. She thought about her mother, stronger every day, singing again while she cooked. She thought about the other children she'd met who were finding their voices with the help of facility dogs. "It feels," Emma said finally, "like something good came from something bad. Like maybe that terrible night wasn't just about being hurt. Maybe it was also about learning to be strong. About finding out that even when bad things happen, good people and good dogs can help make things better." She knelt down and wrapped her arms around Ranger's neck, the golden retriever who had given her back her childhood, her voice, her courage. "Thank you, buddy," she whispered. "Thank you for being my hero." Ranger licked her face, and Emma giggled, the sound of a child who had survived darkness and found her way back to light. In the years that followed, Emma's law helped establish courthouse facility dog programs in 17 states. Hundreds of children found their voices with the help of specially trained dogs. Ranger continued his work until he retired at age 8, having helped over 200 trauma victims. He lived out his retirement with Officer Chen, visiting schools to teach children about courage and healing. And Emma grew up to become a victim's advocate, working specifically with children who'd witnessed violence. She never forgot the golden retriever who stood beside her when she needed it most, who protected her with his body and healed her with his presence. The story of the girl who pointed at her attacker and said 2 words, "That's him," and the dog whose instinctive protection shocked a courtroom became legend in legal circles. It was taught in law schools as a case study in trauma-informed justice. It was featured in documentaries about facility dogs. It inspired books, articles, and training programs. But for Emma, it was simply the story of how she survived the worst night of her life and discovered that courage comes in many forms, sometimes in the voice that speaks truth, sometimes in the hand that points at injustice, and sometimes in the steady, golden presence of a dog who knows exactly when to stand up and protect the vulnerable. Justice had been served that day in court, but more than that, healing had begun. And in the end, Emma realized that was what mattered most, not just punishing the guilty, but helping the innocent find their way back to wholeness. 2 words, "That's him," had changed everything. And the dog who stood beside her when she spoke them had proved that sometimes the most powerful force in a courtroom isn't evidence or argument or legal precedent. Sometimes it's simply love, loyalty, and the unwavering presence of a friend who never doubts your courage, even when you doubt it yourself. The end.